Welcome, everyone. We may have some more folks come in, but that is absolutely welcome. And I know we have an online presence as well. I'm Melody Brown-Berkins. I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and thank you for being here. Just a quick background, is established in 1989. Dartmouth's Institute of Arctic Studies has long been a distinctive program in U.S. higher education. We center, and specifically that is because we work to center the knowledge, culture, and sovereignty of Arctic peoples, including Arctic Indigenous peoples, in our programs for both students and faculty. We're also a founding member of something called the University of the Arctic, a university without walls, created with currently has over 150 global institutional members dedicated to the ethical and equitable Arctic governance and knowledge sharing. Dartmouth Institute of Arctic Studies has also co-led several innovative partnerships and knowledge sharing programs that advance Arctic climate science, Arctic health and well-being, Arctic governance protocols, and developing guidelines for the ethical, meaningful, impactful, and respectful research done in the Arctic with trusted colleagues in Greenland, Denmark, Alaska, Canada, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, some of our colleagues here, and with partners in Washington, D.C. So tonight our panel discussion is Climate Diplomacy on Thin Ice, Navigating Arctic Cooperation and Polar Governance. And I'm very honored to host an incredible panel here to talk with you about what's going on in the Arctic right now around climate science cooperation, around the future of polar governance, in a time of challenge that we're all trying to navigate, those of us who work in the scientific community, in the diplomatic connections and policy. And we're not going to solve anything tonight. We're hoping more to make sure that you as an audience hear, maybe this is a part of the world you haven't thought about a lot. Maybe you're working in it as a scientist or as a diplomat, but putting all of these ideas together, we wanted to present this to you in some of the conversations we're having internally. We're not always agreeing, but we're trying to come up with a report that's actually funded by the University of the Arctic, a report or a paper that really sets the table for what's going to happen in the next several years in climate science diplomacy in the Arctic, but actually it also connects to polar governance, which we'll talk about a little bit tonight, with what's called the International Polar Year in 2032-33, which is a time when major international projects in science and the poles are often done. So we're looking ahead, we're looking at the challenges being faced today, and we wanted to present that to all of you and have a bit of a Q&A after we present the panel. But our panelists are going to explore, first of all, before I started more, the Arctic is warming, as many of you know, 3 to 4 times the rate of the rest of the planet. So a lot of these issues of our Arctic climate science, of the governance of science, is not a future question. This is happening right now. It's actually already happening. Sea ice is melting. Permafrost is thawing. People are being displaced from their Arctic homes. And as you may know, there are about 4 million people above the Arctic Circle who live there. And of that, 400,000 are Arctic Indigenous peoples who lived there for thousands of years. So this was the status when many of us have been working in Arctic governance and Arctic science for a long time. But in 2022, the geopolitical landscape of the Arctic shifted dramatically following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which paused over 25 years of traditional Arctic Council, intergovernmental forum. I think I have a photo here if I do it right. There's the Arctic Council. For 25 years, this Arctic Council would meet and think about the future of environment sustainability in the Arctic. And it was with the Arctic nations, with Arctic Indigenous peoples, and observer states. And it is considered the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among these Arctic states, Arctic Indigenous peoples, and other Arctic inhabitants. And its focus and its charge were, again, specifically focused on sustainable development and environmental protection in the Arctic. And it was not supposed to consider anything about security or military. I'll move quickly to I'm not doing that if I do this correctly, moving you to what it looks like This is one of their, a schematic of the Arctic Council. And as you see, there's 8 member states, 6 working groups, 6 indigenous permanent participant organizations. And to give those names, first of all, the Arctic member states, Canada, Kingdom of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. And the permanent participants, this is something that drew me to Arctic governance, is really the idea, I'm actually originally from Fairbanks, Alaska, and understanding that Arctic governance on sustainability, environment, climate also had the equal input of permanent participants, as the Aleut International, the Arctic Athabascan Council, Gwich'in Council International, Inuit Circumpolar Council, Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of North, and the Sami Council. But as meant, and these are the kinds of impacts. This is the Arctic Council Working Group, Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, had summaries for policymakers about issues in climate. And these are the kinds of working group outputs that the Arctic Council might do. But in February 2022, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and that caused the United States and all of the other Arctic nations to have a joint statement following that invasion that said there would be a pause in the Arctic Council. There was some limited re-engagement in 2022. And there's a 2-year rotating chairship during the Norwegian chairship, which has been 23 to 25. There has been a push, and we're very proud of the Norwegian chairship has done a great job trying to hold the Arctic Council together, think about these issues, and is allowing virtual and written working group engagement that does include Russia, but there is still a challenge. So I'm going to leave it there as the idea that this is a space. There's Arctic science cooperation around the world. There is a governance regime that includes the Arctic indigenous peoples, and that has been a focus and an area for these kinds of collaborations. But geopolitical tensions have come into the Arctic Council in an unprecedented way that it has now paused. There are some engagements, virtual and written, going forward. It is a vibrant chairship under Norway. But as it moves forward, the question, as we move into these big issues of like the International Polar Year for 2032-33, are there pathways where we can find cooperation again? Do we need to? These are the questions that our group is talking about, and that gives me a good segue to go sit down with them. And I will introduce them. To my left is Øvretveit, the manager and researcher of the Arctic Science Diplomacy Project at the University of Bergen and Academy Europaea in Bergen, Norway. At the end, Volker Rackold, who's the head of the German Arctic office at the Alfred Wegener Institute and Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research, Germany. Matthias Kaiser, professor emeritus at the Center for the Study of Sciences and Humanities at the University of Bergen, is also a fellow of the International Science Council in Norway. And Jenny Baseman, in the middle, is an Arctic and polar consultant and a former executive director of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. So again, we're talking also polar research, and a former director of the Climate and Cryosphere Project here in the United States. So this is a group that we think about these issues a lot. We've actually been on stages in Iceland and Berlin in various capacities talking about these, and our conversations continue to evolve. Our biggest issue is who is thinking about the future of Arctic science diplomacy, who are thinking about where are the pathways moving forward, what are the possibilities, and how does this impact climate science? Does this impact how we think about the polar regions? And can we find sustainable, inclusive, ethical pathways for research that we hope always include Arctic indigenous peoples in the future of climate science and diplomacy? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And first, a question for Ole. So our group has been working through these conversations about how and in what ways Arctic cooperation continues. But you've been to many places where folks are talking about this and how the current challenges of Arctic cooperation are impacting everything from climate to marine science. Can you give me a little understanding of what you're hearing around the world?
Yeah, thank you. We at the University of Bergen made a report a year after should I put it on?
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry. Yeah, we made a report that we launched last year where we looked at the effects of the war and the sanctions on science diplomacy and science collaboration in the Arctic. And what we first have to understand that with the war and with the loss of Russia as a partner in the Arctic, we lose also half of the geography, half of the area to study. And that, of course, has effects on how we understand how climate and other issues develop in the Arctic. The climate research, I mean, we know a lot about how the climate is developing, but certain issues I think it's extremely important that we keep an eye on, and not least methane emissions. A colleague of mine at the University of Bergen is working on the island of Svalbard, and they see how this picture is evolving much faster. The emissions is happening a lot faster than we thought. And if this is also the truth for the whole of Siberia, that's a big issue that we need more data on. The ocean science has also been, of course, important to study Arctic oceans north of Russia. And what we are seeing now is that the ocean is changing fast in the Arctic. It's getting warmer, and it's getting what we call the we see an Atlantification of areas that previously has been Arctic oceans, and that is not least true for the Barents Sea and the areas deeper in above the Russian lands areas. And the Arctic has been a special region where collaboration and peaceful cooperation, not least on science and knowledge production, has been at the forefront of what has been happening there. And these networks that has been built over the decades are strong, and they have been built in many areas and fields, and not just networks but also institutions. And what we see now, as with the Arctic Council, is there's a large chance that these will erupt and vanish, which is, of course, a challenge because it takes so long time to build these up, and we have invested in building these networks in students over the decades, and that's a big challenge. Of course, for the indigenous people, and you also mentioned the indigenous people of the Arctic has a special role and has a special saying in Arctic development, also politically and institutionally. When losing contact with indigenous partners in Russia, well, it gives us less, these networks becomes less strong, and we also lose knowledge and knowledge systems. And I also would like to mention, you talked about the Arctic Council, so we don't have to go deeper into that now, but what we see is also that we are looking into the future Arctic as a divided Arctic, a Western Arctic, and a more Oriental Arctic, or an Arctic where Russia, together with China, maybe India and other partners, are doing their things on that side, and we are doing our things on this side. And of course, the whole Arctic discourse these last two and a half years have changed a lot, from being an area where we discuss science collaboration, soft diplomacy, to really focusing much more on security. And of course, it makes sense, doesn't it? It's not irrational. And we must discuss security when we discuss the Arctic, but I think it's very important that we also keep working to get the soft diplomacy up on top of the agenda, at least as a major and important part of the picture. And finally, we see new actors positioning themselves in the Arctic as these institutions and networks, the Arctic Council, become less strong drivers of Arctic agenda and discourse. Other countries like France, China, position themselves in the Arctic. This is it's good that the world is seeing the importance of being and understanding what's going on in the Arctic, but it might also be negative both for the Arctic countries in general and the Arctic as a region, not least for Arctic local communities and indigenous people who might lose a saying and arenas for voice for their interest in the Arctic.
Thank you. I'm not going to thank you. You have the microphone already, Volker, because I was going to go to you and say something you talked about in when we were together in Reykjavik, that the Germany recently launched, or was it German Arctic Office or the Germany an Arctic strategy that was focused on security, strategy, strategic alliances, and the rule of law. And the U.S. has also launched some Arctic strategies on these similar focus areas. How does this, for Germany and many other both Arctic nations and others in the EU, what does this mean for how you conduct current Arctic research and what you're thinking of in the future with Russia, with other partners? Are there boundaries? Are there challenges?
I think I would start.
Okay.
Is it not on?
Green, good.
Now it's on. Okay. I think I should start with explaining why Germany is interested in Arctic research at all. I mean, it's a historical thing. So Germany has a huge Arctic research program. The institute where I am working with, the Øvretveit Institute, I think it's actually the largest research institute in the world for polar and marine research. We have our own icebreaker, so it has a long tradition in Germany doing Arctic research. And one of the motivations, of course, is what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So the changes we see in the Arctic, they are affecting everyone, and also us in Germany and in Europe. So that is one of the motivations for us to do research in the Arctic. There are others as well, of course. It's also protecting the environment of the Arctic. There are also some, of course, economic interests, we have to admit. That's a thing that we had also in our last version of the Arctic policy that we published in 2019, which was very much focused on environmental protection and sustainable development. But now the new one that just came out 2 months ago still has the focus on environment and climate and sustainable development, but the main priority actually is security. And that is, as already Ola explained, this is pretty obvious. If you look at the map of the Arctic and look at the NATO membership, especially with the membership of Sweden and Finland, now we have 8 countries in the Arctic. 1 is Russia, and the other 7 are NATO members. And of course, security is a big issue, and it has a very high priority in the German Arctic policy. Of course, we are not really active in defense activities in the Arctic, but we are also NATO members, and of course, we are supporting the NATO and making sure that things in the Arctic stay peaceful, but the mechanism for that mainly is actually deterrence rather than dialogue, and that is of course a very sad, but I think just realistic development that we see. So the new German policy also talks about keeping the rules-based orders working. I think that's very important. I mean, if countries are not really following the international rules, like obviously Russia is not doing, this could also happen in the Arctic. And that is also a very high priority of the policy. Still, of course, science and environment is still there. And I think it's also important to note that the policy explicitly mentions the need for excellent science as a mechanism for policy decisions. I think that's, when we talk about science diplomacy, that is actually science diplomacy. So have solid science for policy decisions. And that is a very high priority in the policy. And it also talks about what Ola already mentioned, the indigenous peoples. So that also, of course, for non-Arctic countries, the rights of the indigenous peoples are extremely important. And that goes also into science. So the German policy also talks about doing science in a way that integrates and is done together with the indigenous peoples from the very beginning. And I think that's the thing in most Arctic countries, this is, I would say, even kind of standard by now. But for the non-Arctic countries, it's not. And I think for my country, many people, this is quite new, that you work, of course, on indigenous land. So you work in an area where people live since millennia, and of course they own the land. So they are not only the knowledge, they are the right holders. And of course you have to do your research together with those people and make it useful for them, and also really in close dialogue. And that is also a very important component of the new German Arctic policy guidelines. I think we're probably, with the US, the first country that adopted the policy guidelines after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So most countries haven't done that so far. But I would assume when Finland or Sweden come up with their new policy, it would be probably quite similar, and that the focus would also move away from, let's say, environment and climate more to security, which is just the thing we probably have to accept, seeing the new situation. Of course, also new actors play a role in the policy. We also talk about the role of China in the Arctic, which is a thing. But Russia, of course, is the main thing. And policy explicitly says that we don't consider Russia at the moment a partner for research in the Arctic. And this, especially for Germany, a pretty, how to say, drastic change, because for us, over the last 30 years, Russia was the strongest partner actually in Arctic research. So, which means that our scientists, overnight, they had to change their research and their working area from Russia. And they are now mainly working in Canada. So Canada is the main partner. They also work in Greenland or in Scandinavia. But really overnight, all the science was cut and stopped and moved to other regions, which was not easy, of course, for people who was sometimes had been working in Siberia for 30 years. I started myself my career in the 90s working in Siberia. And of course, we also have many friends and colleagues in Russia, and that is also an issue. You still want, I think we talk about that a bit more later, you still do not want to cut the bridges completely. So you want to still keep that personal contact that you still have alive, though any institutional cooperation is, of course, not allowed anymore, so we're not doing that. But still, of course, we talk to people in Russia, which is not easy, because we know that email is probably a bit dangerous to send, because you don't know who's reading that email. You know? So it's all delicate and difficult, but still, I think, very important that these personal communication channels are kept open, because we are still hoping, and that's also mentioned in the policy, that of course Germany is open to restart cooperation with Russia once it's possible. We don't know when it is, but of course we are hopeful.
Thank you. Matthias, I'm going to, the mic, thank you, next, is that you not only work at the University of Bergen, as I said, you're also a fellow of the International Science Council, and so many in the Arctic and the global scientific community are concerned about this loss of data in the Arctic with the lack of institutional Russian engagement and cooperation. Can you comment on what that might mean to you and your work or the work of your colleagues? And then secondly, how you think the pathway might move forward. I'll get to the international polio in just a minute, but are there different ways we can work in science, in Arctic science, to manage to do more even without some of these conversations with Russia?
Thank you very much, Melody. Well, first of all, I mean, I think there are some basic truths that everybody who is in science knows, that the quality of our science is highly dependent on the quality of our data, right? So the more and the better data we have, the better is the output of it, right? Very simple. So, and if we want to have good, reliable data on a big area, like, you know, the Arctic area, then of course we do want very good data and, you know, all of that. That is one thing. So in that sense, there's a drive from the science point of view towards sort of opening that up and make that possible. And that is, well, but in addition, there's another thing to consider, and that is the science we do is always taking part, it's always a part of our political realities, right? I mean, you know this here, we know this in our countries. We need the funding, we need very often permissions to do certain kind of research, you know, and all of that. So, and that is why, and we have heard about the Arctic Council, which is a political body, right? It's politically appointed, at least, and has been enabling a lot of good research, right? Also because they had all these data. Now what we see is there is this change. The change is there because of the political circumstances, not because of the science, right? So of course then the sciences are concerned about that, right? And hey, can't we just keep on doing that? Well, and as Volker was just saying, that is, the answer depends on whom you ask, right? If we ask, and very often we have to say our friends in the Russian institutes, right? They, of course, they see the same things as we do, right? And they want to continue that kind of work because it also enriches their work, right? However, they are part of the system that has changed course, I would say dramatically, right? From working together with a global political and scientific environment and sort of going now a different way. Where it is going, we don't know yet, right? So in that sense, of course, we are concerned about it. On the other hand, what we want to do globally with our science is we want to contribute to positive changes, right? We want to do something not only for the indigenous people that live there, you know, of course this is a very important point, but also for the environment and in the end for ourselves. Because as we have just said, right, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there, right? It goes all over, right? With bioclimate and all of these things. Anyway, so we want to have that change. And the question then arises, is the science that we have already or that we can produce on a limited basis, is that science good enough, right, to actually help us make decisions? And well, and there we may have different opinions. A lot, I think, points, and we have heard that already, and Ola was saying that we know already a lot of the things in science that hasn't found its ways into the politics that we do, right? So there is already a very good basis for that. So maybe some of the science is already good enough, but even the science that we can do, even with the constraints that we are facing, is sort of good enough to make reasonable policies if people are willing to listen, and if we as scientists relate us in a good way to the political circumstances around it. And the final thing I want to say is, though, that that does not mean, I think, that we should not, and rather the opposite. I mean, we should, as scientists, take a special responsibility for maintaining a global community of sciences, right? In that sense, we are sometimes working with governments, but here we may be also working against certain politicizations of issues, right? There remain knowledge factors that only a global community really can address in a very good manner. So I think that is at least my viewpoint so far.
Thank you very much. And Jenny, either
one. Double. You can stereo.
Okay, karaoke time. Little Ice Ice Baby, perhaps tonight. I don't know.
I was going to give. Oh, I don't know if I can do this. Maybe it's not there. Maybe it's here. I think I can go to. There we are. I was going to go and give you a slide. I think if I can do it correctly. Let's see. Yes. I'm going to put them all up for you behind you, Jenny. Because my question for you was that you have been part of previous plannings for international polar years. And I've given you all a little bit of a preview of, no, you haven't been back
just
to 1850, just one. But international polar years are really where this Arctic and polar science cooperation has come, worked with policymakers to showcase priorities for what we need to move forward. And again, the next one is scheduled right now, 2032-33. Planning has already started. Can you explain why these are important and how international science cooperation in polar regions has really given the information to ensure these programs address critical issues facing both the polar regions and the world, and who is included in all of that?
Sure, I can try. So I've only been involved in the planning of one so far, and that was the last one in 2007. Thanks, though, for the... I guess I must look pretty good for being involved in the earlier ones, too. I think the International Polar Years, well, the first one was in 1882. Karl Øvretveit was contributed to starting that, and it was mostly Antarctica, trying to get different nations together to coordinate research for a year to share data and to learn more about the countries, and then, the science. And then the second one was in 32, so 100 years after the last one. And then the IGY, which is probably one of the better known ones. There's a song, for those of you who like 80s music, called the IGY, which has nothing to do with the International Geophysical Year except the title. But check that out. I'm sure it's on Spotify or something. But that was the big one, where it was 67 nations were involved, and a lot of great space science came out of that, radio waves, and a lot of amazing things came out of that. But one of the really incredible things that came out of that was the creation of the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, which is an organization that then still exists, of course, and helps to coordinate all of the research that's going on in Antarctica. And after that came the creation of the Antarctic Treaty. So no one owns the Antarctic continent. So it's not governed by any particular country, but it is governed no one owns it, so it's not governed by a country, but it is governed by this treaty that was signed in 1959 by a number of different countries that have agreed to set aside Antarctica for peace and for science. And that treaty has held up to today, and hopefully will continue in the future. And that is really important, because there's this whole continent at the bottom of the world that is really just about science and collaboration. And those of us who've been fortunate enough to work there and be there know how special that is. And that came out of the second last IPY. IPY 4, which was in 2007 to 2008, was also quite special. And some of the reasons why the IPY in general is important is because they're projects that happen during an International Polar Year one country alone can't do. And so it's really all about international cooperation and collaboration. And often these projects start grassroots. Scientists that know each other get together and they come up with great ideas, often on a napkin in a bar. Sorry, but it's true. That's how UArctic was formed, University of the Arctic. And that's how these great ideas happen. And so these scientists get together, they come up with these great ideas. And in the IPY4, there were two great leaders, Chris Rapley and Robin Bell. And Robin, there's often these international years that happen that are sanctioned by the UN. IPY, those same years, was actually also the International Year of the Potato. And they didn't quite have the same research level that we did. But so Robin Bell made the point that we could have done a great celebration, which most international years are, where they just do some outreach and a big celebration of potatoes, which, I mean, who doesn't like a good French fry or baked potato? But Robin and Chris and a number of other wonderful people said, no, let's make this really about research. And that's what made IPY4 very different and the other International Polar Years, and hopefully the next International Polar Year, where it's really about getting international science together to tackle the big questions that not one nation can do. And I think that's really the big thing. The last International Polar Year, some major achievements, I think we could say, happened. It was the first time that social sciences was included, which was a huge contribution. It was also, there was a huge hope and desire to have more Indigenous participation. Was it perfect? No, but it was a start, and I think there was a lot of really good projects that came out of that. It was also the first time that education and outreach or communication of science was considered important. Every single one of the 220 international polar year projects had to have a science communication and outreach component. That's the first time in, I think, history that science projects had to include education, because we can't just sit in our universities and our ivory towers and do our science. Because, as Volker said, what happens at the polls doesn't stay at the polls. And who funds most science, right? It's the public. So if we're not telling them why we're doing this stuff, why should they keep funding it? And the polar regions, right? Yes, the indigenous involvement is so important, but it's also about place sometimes, right? Like, every person on this planet is affected by what happens at the polar regions, be it sea level rise, be it the Atlantic current that's shutting down, that's going to change the whole continent climate of Europe. Sea level rise, of course. Like, there's all these things that are happening that every person on this planet is immediately touched by polar regions. And so that was, I think, one of the major outcomes of IPY4 was that this education component. And most of the projects, if they didn't have funding for it, they had some partner. And the International Coordination Office was very, very good at this. Dave and Rianne and Nicola, if a project had a really good science or a communication idea, but they didn't have any money, they would find a museum or they would find a center where they could partner with them to get that message out. And unfortunately, over the years, that has kind of dwindled. And so I really hope this next International Polar Year can bring some of that back. The other great part that came out of the IPY, and that is the creation of this organization called the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. And it wasn't necessarily this organization or apex that was so great. It was the realization of the importance of early career scientists and grad students and postdocs that are involved in all the science projects, because they're often the ones on the ground doing all this research, and the importance of getting them involved in planning of the science, of helping to coordinate sessions at conferences, at meaningful leadership positions early in their career, at helping them collaborate and participate in international activities and interdisciplinary activities right at the beginning. Because usually it was all these gray hair, white haired guys that were the ones sitting at the table on these international committees. And no offense, but yeah. And so for the first time, it was a different dynamic, or it was a little diverse at some of these things. And it took a while for some of those certain folks, not this guy here, but to accept that. But now you can't go to a polar research conference without there being tons of young researchers in leadership positions. And I think, and I presented a lot at ICSU, or now International Science Council, on how we kind of changed the face of polar research, and that has trickled down into other fields of science. So that was a major legacy. I'm talking forever, sorry. You give me a microphone and this is what happens. The other great thing that came out of IPY4 was there's two organizations that help to coordinate international science in the polar regions. One is the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which I mentioned earlier, that came out of IPY3. And then there's the International Arctic Science Committee, or IASC. This was the first time these two organizations got together on almost a daily basis. I mean, you and Mike talked all the time and worked together, and they created what was called a bipolar action group. I know, a terrible acronym for politically correctness, but it was the first time these organizations came together and tried to say, okay, what are the big science questions that we can tackle together on a long-standing basis, right? Not just every 25 or 50 years, but on a long-standing basis. And I think that was a huge achievement. And there's still some interaction between these two groups, and I think that was great. What else was I supposed to say? I think that was it.
Okay. Actually, it's a perfect...
Sorry, that was a lot.
No, it's a perfect segue for my next round here of of questions. Is really, so what you can see is we're dealing with two poles. We're dealing with one which is a continent that is uninhabited, surrounded by water. That's the Antarctic. We have another that is an ocean surrounded by inhabited land of Arctic nations and Arctic sovereign indigenous peoples. So in the last IPY, some conversations about how that was moving forward. Dartmouth is involved, and actually my project manager is up in the corner if she waves her hand, Varvara Kina Williams, on a project called Indigenizing Arctic Research, which is for a decadal Arctic research planning work, thinking about how there is more indigenous-led knowledge co-production in the Arctic spaces as not just an important thing to do, which other events have wanted to do, but as a piece of the structure of the future of science for these big international science cooperation efforts. I think how these have come together in my mind is this pause, this challenge in working in the Arctic Council that we talked about at the beginning, has made a challenge for some knowledge creation at both at the scientific knowledge creation level of the working groups, but also the political knowledge creation of indigenous peoples and Arctic nations to work together in the way it used to with the Arctic Council. We hope it comes back, but right now it's paused. We've talked about it as a guide and a framework for how the future of Arctic research and knowledge production and governance might happen. So as we look to the International Polar Year, are there structural changes that Jenny was mentioning? Now we have young people. We wouldn't even think to have this. And Volker, I'll go to you first, because you mentioned Germany is, as an EU nation, as a NATO nation, is thinking we have to approach Arctic research differently. Could that also go to the International Polar Year? And how would you think about that?
I mean, there are two different things. If you talk about the Arctic Council, of course, the Arctic Council is a political organization.
Yes.
And that's a very big difference compared to the Polar Year. The Polar Year, and that's how the last Polar Year was working, and I would assume that the next one will be working the same way, is a truly bottom-up process. So that in the last Polar Year, the way we did it, we invited the scientific community to come up with just expressions of interest. And everyone, each PhD student could submit a little paper and just say, okay, I would like to do this, I propose this. And we received more than 2,000 of these expressions of interest, and then we grouped them into proposals. And that is how the 200-something, how many? 220 projects were formed. So basically, every scientist had the chance to contribute. And I think that was very important, because that was the buy-in, that you have really scientists buy into the IPY and see their contribution. The Arctic Council, of course, is a very different thing, because it's top-down things. So there's the ministers meeting every 2 years, and then underneath are this senior Arctic officials meeting every 6 months, and then the lowest level are the working groups, and their function is actually to advise the Arctic Council, to compile science, and to advise the Council. So, of course, the Arctic Council and also the Antarctic Treaty, they were invited to participate and to contribute to the IPY, but they were more like observers on the IPY. It was really a scientific effort by the scientific community, and of course by many educators and outreach people, indigenous peoples, northerners. So in total, the last IPY had something like 50,000 participants, and that's an enormous number of people, of course. So working in the polar regions for almost 2 full years. And we have to see how that works for the next one, because one thing that, of course, we see now is that, as I said already, it's not only for Germany, an institutional cooperation with Russia is not possible for many countries. And of course, one of the success stories of the IPY was that it was truly international. So that means all the big IPY projects, of course, they had partners from many, many countries, including, of course, also Russia. So, and even if we encourage, let's say, a personal dialogue with Russian colleagues and sometimes even Russian friends, there will be challenged to be, of course, if Russian institutions would participate in IPY. And of course, we know what will happen, or we expect what happens, and some countries, for example, my country, but I would guess also the US or Finland or Sweden would just say, okay, no, if Russian partners are there, we won't participate. So, and that is also something that happened in the Arctic Council. Yeah? So that, and this is of course, a challenge for us. How can we come to a solution for an IPY which is truly international, yeah, with the current geopolitical situation? And that is the thing why we are here, actually. That's what we're discussing since today, and we have 2 more days, and I'm not sure if we come to a solution, but at least we have some ideas, maybe. And going back to the last IP, to the IGY in 57 that Jenny mentioned, that is always considered the one prime example for science diplomacy, because the Antarctic Treaty that was formed after these 2 years of research was really based on scientific cooperation. So when science really motivated a political decision. And of course, many people are hoping that the next International Polar Year will solve all the problems we have, which may be a bit naive to think, but still, of course, we are looking towards what can we do, or how can we change the situation that this International Polar Year, first of all, can be organized in the way we want it, and then secondly, really contribute to solving the problems that we have. It remains to be seen. We still have a couple of years, but to believe that it's just the answer to everything is probably very naive and not realistic.
Well, thank you. And Ola, I'm going to ask you, again, sort of building on that, is specifically back to climate diplomacy. And so we've seen you've now kind of got a framework of what's going on. There are future meetings that we hope will have everyone involved, science-informed, bottom-up. We have some challenges at a governance level in the Arctic that we're working through. But climate is now. It's already wreaking havoc on the Arctic and parts of the Antarctic, but really in the Arctic, it is people's lives are being changed. Is there something that you would speak to in terms of this science cooperation and its urgency around the International Polar Year is 2032-33. Hopefully we can find pathways to more cooperation and inclusive governance with all knowledge systems. But what keeps you up at night in terms of the climate science or climate science diplomacy between now and then? Do we have time to wait till 2032-33? Should we be doing something now?
I would say that the last IPCC report said that we have that what our actions the next decade will have effects in the next millennia.
Yeah.
So cutting off vital both data and knowledge from half of the Arctic, I see that as a large challenge in getting on the right track as far as the how we deal with the climate change, and not just the data. I think also even though we have we don't like the Russian regime and the country's actions now, I think it's still also important to acknowledge the knowledge and the scientific competence that Russia has had during the last decades in understanding how the climate is changing. And this is as far as how what we need to do during the next decade to get on the right track with dealing with these issues. I would just like also to bring up the fact that even though we are very clear that we don't want to collaborate with Russia, well, we still do. And speaking from a Norwegian perspective, where the interest is strong enough, we keep collaborations alive. And one example of that is the Norwegian-Russian fisheries collaboration, which was established in 1975-76, when the Cold War was at its coldest, because it's in both countries' interests to keep the fish stocks sustainable. And this has been kept alive and running, this both scientific and management collaboration between Norway and Russia through the decades, and it hasn't stopped. It hasn't been affected by the sanctions, so it's still alive. And I think that maybe that's something that we should keep in mind when we look at also climate. That where interest, like a common interest, bilateral, multilateral, global, is strong enough, that might be a place to start having collaboration on some level large enough that it will have effect.
Thank you. Matthias, I was going to go to you next. And if you don't mind, I was going to kind of delve a little bit deeper into, so thank you, Ole, and then in going into these structures that could change as we look to climate science, which is ultimately a transdisciplinary science. And you and the International Science Council have been looking at transdisciplinary science and its future. And also the International Science Council has been thinking about something called flipping the model. Do you see how the structure of science cooperation, climate science specifically, could change both and informed by some of the work in the Arctic and in the polar regions as we move to the International Polar Year? Are there some structural changes that the International Science Council and the Arctic peoples have been asking for?
That is actually a point that I would very much argue for, also because I'm not really an Arctic scientist. I have been working with indigenous people, but in different areas, right, and not specifically in the Arctic. And I would also refer to what you said, that we have learned a lot of structural changes and also in how we do the science. Also in the last one, as you mentioned, the inclusion of younger researchers, sort of marked quite a structural change. And I think, and I also very much think in terms of the global challenges that we as, let's say, responsible scientists try to address, that those global challenges are such that we need to change the science that we are used to do. Business as usual in the sciences is not an option anymore. I mean, it has been the 2024 assessment of how close we are to reach the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, by 2030 is what they said. Well, you have to take the numbers with a pinch of salt, but 14% of those are on track. All the other 84 are not on track or even reversed, right? So, and that is not only because of science. There is a lot of politics involved, but it is also because of the sciences, right? We have not contributed enough of what we could contribute to make change that is necessary possible. And in that sense, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do better? And we have talked about this. We may have had this attitude towards other knowledge systems where we sort of, us as scientists, as superior to them, rather than to have them included, sort of, and listening, and make them listen to us as well, right? But then go out and find what are the problems that we need to study, not go out and say, we have that problem and you can be part of that. So not this top-down, as you were saying, but more sort of let it grow from the bottom. Have new networks of not only indigenous groups, but also professional groups and other traditional knowledge systems, and and work together with them in a new way, right? And that is what we now describe as the transdisciplinary, that is switching the science model, using a lot of time actually also on, just how are we going to address these problems, right? And that means a lot of structural change. That is a big challenge, also when we think in terms of the sciences. That is a challenge in terms of the scientific institutions that do the education, but also those that are funding our research. That is, we cannot expect everything to be solved after 2 or 3 years of a project, right? We need to have its different phases and all of those things. And we need to do this differently and globally. We need to work in larger teams with different groups and all of that. And so in that sense, I think this International Polar Year in 2032-33 is also a chance that we have to use that possibility to really say, yes, we want to do science differently. We want to do that. And whatever the politics are complex enough, difficult enough, but we have a problem also in doing the right science for the future that we want, and in this area for the Arctic. So, and I think in that sense, it's a positive challenge for us, but there is maybe a good hope that we can do that well. Some people are more optimistic than others.
Well, may I ask the panel, is this just the right way to do science, or does this make better climate science that's more impactful, more meaningful, and can actually meet the climate challenge? Is it just the right thing to do to flip science models, or is this climate science, as we progress, actually better knowledge?
Shall I?
Sure, you can start.
Well, first of all, it is not an either-or. We still do need the discipline, the sort of the narrow models sometimes, the specialist knowledge. We do need that still. It is not that we want to get rid of that.
Right.
But we haven't put it in the right framework yet. And that is what we're saying when we talk about the transdisciplinary sort of change, flipping the science model. We need to have that included in a larger research activity that we call transdisciplinary, or, there are different names maybe to that, but where we work together with those groups, where we don't go and tell the others, oh, yes, your problem is so-and-so, and I have my model to solve this, right? But we develop the ability to listen together with them and say, yes, but my colleague here has this very interesting knowledge from whatever discipline, right? and then we can sort of maybe develop something together and a more inclusive sort of knowledge production that hopefully can help it. Otherwise, if we continue as we have done all the time before, with the same structures, it will not make any positive difference at all, right? So we need to try that. That is at least my belief. And that will, in the end, give a better quality of the knowledge that we can produce.
Thank you. Yeah, Jay.
Both of them again.
Oh, yeah.
Double-fisted. You guys know me so well. I think it's great that we're talking about including Indigenous right holders for Arctic research. I also think we shouldn't forget about the importance of the business sector.
Yes.
And the energy sectors. The world is a big place, right? And the poles are affecting the whole world. And if we're going to flip the model, I think we really flip the model.
Yeah.
And without that completely happening, we have to completely make a paradigm shift, in my opinion. And it can't just be let's incorporate residents and make it societally relevant. It's got to incorporate business and policy, of course, which we were talking about, and energy, and some of these other sectors too, because climate change is a big problem, and if we're going to shift the paradigm, it's got to be really shifted.
Can I just have a footnote to that? Climate is one thing, but just remember, not so long ago we had a pandemic, and there are a lot of lessons from that we have to collaborate. Not only with business. All of a sudden, the medical people had to learn that they have to, work with people who do education, in school and all of these things, or others. So it was a much more comprehensive effort. And those lessons can inform us also for other areas that are of that complexity. Yeah.
Thank you. And I have one last round before I open up for questions. And maybe it's just a simple question. But what is the one thing that if you were able to tell the folks managing these Arctic challenges right now, the Arctic Council, the International Arctic Science Committee, trying to navigate geopolitical tensions, and those who are now going to work with the Antarctic researchers and thinking about the climate urgency as we develop this international polar year, is there one thing you would like them to think about that seems to be not on the table right now that you as Ola, just something you would like to give advice to as we move forward? What should they be thinking about? Who should they be thinking about? And how do we move climate action forward?
I think we should keep we should keep in mind the knowledge that already exists in the Arctic region across borders, both in indigenous communities and also in the academic institutions and in the communities there on how to both understand how the region is developing and how to adapt to climate change. Both the knowledge and keeping the dialogue as open as possible with the communities in the Arctic. Yeah.
Thank you. Volker, if you'd like to.
I think from a scientific point of view, we know quite a lot actually. So this is we're moving away from these big assessments where we study the Arctic or Antarctic. We know more or less what's happening. There are still many open science questions, I think, but they are smaller questions. They are more specific questions, I think. I think the biggest issue that we have is that we don't see any reactions in the policy. And that is the point. This week there are, 50,000 people meeting in Baku to negotiate climate. And when you ask climate scientists, they will all tell you, I don't expect anything from that meeting. Yeah? And that is the big issue we have. So there is this big gap between science and politics. So, and I would wish that those countries who are engaged in Arctic research or Antarctic research or are part of the Arctic Council, be it member or observer or part of the Antarctic Treaty, that they would raise their voice more strongly in global climate negotiations because they see what's happening in their backyard. Take the 8 Arctic countries, they see firsthand how climate change is affecting their region. And that doesn't happen. And I think that would be really important that the countries observing these changes in the Arctic and also in the Antarctic, of course, in the Antarctic Treaty, that they would have a stronger voice in global climate negotiations to make a change and make things happen and not just do business as usual. And, the latest numbers that we have by 2100, we are still at 2.7 degrees compared to pre-industrial temperatures. And that's, of course, a nightmare. And then if you just mentioned at the beginning that the Arctic warms 3 or 4 times faster than the rest of the globe, and just multiply 2.7 with 4, and you know what we have to expect in the Arctic. It's something like 10 degrees. It's maybe a bit naive to do it that way, but just give you an idea. Yeah?
Shall I? Yes, but I want to add a different point of view, a more philosophical one, if I may. One of the things, and we have already mentioned the importance of science to communicate. What I think one of the mistakes that we have learned recently with this, post-fact, or whatever we call this area now, is that communicating facts is not enough to bring about any change. Going out and tell the people, hey, you got it wrong, I have my data and that is right. We end up hitting each other in the head, and it doesn't really change. Because also what we've learned is in these complex areas, the facts are mostly still disputed, even among scientists sometimes. And that is used against the science also. So, but what we have to realize is that we need to have a discussion about the values that drive the changes. That is, what is it good for? The values in not the sense that, what I think is good right now, but what is the kind of a future that I would wish, first of all, to experience myself, but at least my children or my grandchildren to have. How can we characterize the qualities of that future? Right? The sustainable development goes some way towards that, but it's not all, right? So it has a lot to do with respect, for example, traditions, that many communities want to say that, oh, whatever we do and whatever the development may be, whatever the technologies may be, but we want to basically uphold the principal values of our culture, of our sometimes, indigenous community or whatever. And we differ in that. There is no such thing as a global, correct list of values. But we need to engage in that discussion with them. And most of the people, once they engage in that, will also see that, well, there are many ways to manage that. And sometimes we need to sort of take consideration of different pathways towards that future. So, but open up that kind of discussion. Well, not only saying that, oh, scientists, we deal with the facts only and believe the values to the politicians. We are not in that world anymore. We are all part of a value discussion as a citizen in our country. And that communication we also need to engage in, I think.
Jenny, do you have a
I
thought?
I love it.
You have the center seat.
What would I tell the leaders of the current
Sure.
organizations? Is that, well, there's lots of things, but
For climate action. Yeah.
climate action, okay. Two things, I think. One is listen to the past. And I don't necessarily mean read the literature papers, but talk to the people who did the negotiations. Because what I've been learning, and I think all of us can, it's not the stuff that's published in the papers that you learn about, particularly for the negotiations that happen at these levels. It's what happens in the corridors during the coffee break, or again at the networking or at the banquets. It's where 2 or 3 like-minded people get together and start sharing their ideas, and those 3 or 4 people push something. And you would be surprised at the creation of the Arctic Council happened that way. Right? Like, that's how these things happen. And so those nuggets, those pieces of wisdom, I think, are really important, particularly today, with all these different geopolitical things that are happening. Because there's friendships that still exist, right? And I'm including China and Brazil and all these other, India, right? We all have these friendships. And there's some amazing things that can come out of that. So listen to the past stories and create opportunities for these small networking events, because I really think, particularly, we got used to COVID and all these Zooms, but it's still getting people together and making those human connections that is crucial. The other thing I would say is to not hinder yourself with, well, how can we get funding for this? I know that's hard to do, particularly as a scientist. But if we don't take the time to really think outside the box and really think big, I think we're going to be very narrow in our ideas. And that's not just about science projects, but it's about communicating science. The Show Your Stripes, created by Ed Hawkins, I just love these, right? On buses, they light it up on the London Tower and the London Bridge. Like, what a great, easy way to show the global climate change. And now we have these Taylor Swift bracelets that are showing up all over. Like, let's get her to wear these and help promote climate change. Like, there's things that we can do to help kind of push this and to educate more people on a different level. It doesn't have to be this academics sitting in a top-down, there's other ways to communicate the importance of climate change and the importance of thinking outside the box and doing things differently. And that's why I'm a big proponent of, let's include business, right? Because especially insurance agencies, I mean, these guys, right? Think of the sea level rise and the money they're going to have to put into that. Well, why aren't they funding sea level research? Seems to me it'd be a lot cheaper for them to fund sea level research than to pay for what's going to happen to Florida. But that's just me trying to think outside the box. So I would say, yeah, those are my 2 things I would like to share.
Thank Thank you. My thanks to we're going to open this up for questions. My thanks for such a wide-ranging discussion on everything from the geopolitics of a Russian invasion in Ukraine and how that's challenging science communications in the Arctic, to thinking ahead to how we actually have more effective, inclusive climate action for our next International Polar Year, and how do we tee that up and get the right people bottom up, engaged, fired up, wearing bracelets, whatever it takes to actually move forward and not just wait for things, but get things moving to happen, where we hope the Arctic, the Antarctic, the polar regions who are experiencing this in such a rapid rate and so disastrously are in the lead. And the peoples of the Arctic, as you heard, are informing, and we're informing them, and we're using our scientific skills, our systems we're changing our scientific systems to actually better understand what's happening on the ground and better include that knowledge for this kind of action. So with that, let me open up to any questions in the room. Oh, thank you. Do we have questions in the room? Anyone?
Hello, my name is Maya. I'm a student here, I'm a junior, and thank you all for sharing your thoughts. This has been really interesting. My question is directed toward Jenny and Kaiser, but if others have something to chime in, feel free. It's going back to the question of businesses and the future of the Arctic and involving scientists and Indigenous knowledge holders in the creation of policy. Specifically, what do we do when businesses and their models oppose the science that is telling us that we must transition away from fossil fuels? And what are some tangible ways that scientists and Indigenous knowledge holders can have a greater voice in the creation of policy?
Go for it.
No, thank you. It is a highly relevant question that you're asking, because that happens, and it can be really difficult. Before I give a more direct answer to that, I want to comment on something that you said about the insurance companies. For me personally, and I have been, as you can see, not only with the color of my hair, but I've been around for some time. I joined the International Society for Risk Assessment in the early 1990s. And I went to one of the first conferences in Germany. At that time, it was even in the scientific community, climate change was, really sort of, it was just coming up, but it was sort of very uncertain. That conference was funded by one of the big insurance companies that insured insurance companies, What? Munich Re, right. And they opened with two states. First of all, we all got a book. They had, produced a book about risk, and that was also at the time when we all thought risk is something objective out there in the world. And they said, risk is a social construct. Science were going like, oh God, yeah. By now, we have more or less accepted that. And the other thing they said is, we don't need to talk about climate change, because for us, it's a fact. We're already paying for it, right? So if we look at our payments, we can see how that has already, happened. So, and we ask you to sort of look at the essential things. Now, that just supports the point that there is important partnerships to consider, like in the insurance companies. But also in general, in the business, I think there is something where certain business, particularly when they don't have a monopoly, need to be interested in their reputation, that they take care of our values, be that health. Pharmaceutical industry that is shown to be, produce products that are damaging people, so they need to uphold that picture of a good image in the public. Otherwise, they don't make any business. And that goes for many other businesses as well, right? Sometimes we do have businesses lumping together, like whatever, the tobacco industries or so, that we're trying to withhold evidence, right? in that case, we need a strong scientific voice, sometimes, fighting because we don't have so much funding like the industry has. But in most of the times, it is very often in the interest of, if you look at the interest, it's in the interest of the businesses to have future perspective where they be a part of it, where they are recognized as partners and where they can make good business. So good business is not necessarily bad for society, rather the opposite, right? So be critical in looking for that, but I would say many times you will find a lot of businesses that are interesting for our collaborations. And we have done similar things in risk research, where it is in the interest of the industry very often to reduce all kind of environmental and social risks. So get them on board.
Is that Jenny, I don't know if you want to take the second half of the question, was how do scientists and knowledge holders maybe get more close to policy?
In a way, I think they're kind of tied together, actually. And I think as I look at this audience, it is mostly students, and your generation is already making these choices and changing things with the businesses you don't agree with by using your wallets, right? You're not buying things from companies you don't agree with. And I think that's a huge shift that wasn't around when I was your age, back in the IGY, 50 some years ago, as Melody let you know. I also think there's other things, again, business and policy, because I think they relate, right? We all know there's lobbyists out there. We all know, unfortunately, because of some Supreme Court decisions, and I don't want to get too political, that money runs politics, particularly here in the US. So create a business that competes, right? And I know it sounds all like, hey, we can do it, but there are great examples out there, and you guys are pretty clever. So I think this can happen. The other thing is you can work from within a company, right? You can change structures from within. I mean, us young researchers that were involved in IPY changed the polar research community. I know it's not the same as a company, but we did. And that had trickle-down effects to the whole science internationally. So you can work from within a structure to change things. Obviously, we always hear you can vote, and in countries where you have the ability to vote, that is something you can do. Run for office, I know that presents challenges as well, but those are things that you can do. I mean, it's hard sometimes, but you can also find like-minded people and just have a chat. You'd be surprised the good ideas that can come out. And maybe it's just, a couple people in your hometown that are doing something different. You don't have to change the world with your idea or create a voice, right? It can be a local thing or even, your own school or something. And I think that's sometimes the problem that we have. We think we need to change the world, but sometimes just changing the local anything, right? Or your grocery store, if you tell them, hey, use more paper bags, or, it's a terrible example, but you'd be surprised how things can change and snowball. So that's just my, I don't know, I guess.
Ole?
I would just like to add to this point of what can business do, or how can business be a proactive force in making positive changes in the Arctic. And back to the fishery regime and fishery collaboration, in especially seen from a Norwegian perspective. I mean, from the mid-60s, 1960s to the mid-1970s, literally all Norwegian fish stocks collapsed. And that, of course, also devastated businesses and communities all along the coast. And it gave the rise to a collaboration that is still very vital and I think very important for the management and sustainability of both fisheries and the ocean in general in Norway. And it's a strong collaboration between industry, science and government. And the dialogue there between the actors is strong, and it's built on trust, and it's also even it's on the infrastructure side where science, the scientific institutions use the fishing boats to collect data. So it's that, and I think that's a very good example of how sustainability is in the interest also of industry.
They'll go this, then there. Then go down here first. Oh, never mind. I'll get you too. Sorry. Then I'll go ahead.
Thank you. I'll just go really quick. But I was just kind of quickly hoping to circle back to the discussion kind of earlier about how the Ukrainian war and just the impact on research. And I'm kind of curious, this might be sort of an obvious question, but I understand that collaboration internationally has been pretty much completely stopped. But is there a sense of like what's going on in Russia? I mean, I'm assuming there are Russian researchers that are still able to kind of work in the Russian Arctic. And is there kind of a sense of like looking forward, like regardless of how the conflict changes, like, are there ways to, as you were saying, the fishery sort of collaboration? Is there optimistic ways that maybe some level of collaboration, or at least like publication of Russian research, gets out to the public?
Yeah, I could try to say a few words about that. Now, of course, the science in Russia is very much affected, and I think the Russian scientists, they are not free to do whatever they want, and I think we know many people who actually left the country, several people who left the country, partly because they are afraid that their kids would be taken to military service in the Ukraine. Yeah, and we heard from many people that did. Of course, very much of the research was also dependent on cooperation with Western countries. So we had very long cooperation with Russia, and of course we also provided the equipment. And much of this equipment, even if it's dead, there, of course, it needs some maintenance, and it needs that doesn't really work anymore. So I think Russian science is really very much affected through the stop of cooperation, and we also hear that when we talk to Russian scientists that it is a challenge for them. So maybe it's a good news that the sanctions are working. I'm not sure in that case if it's a good news, but it is affecting the Russian science community a lot. And I think the most important thing is that the pressure that they have from their authorities, and this freedom of doing science is not there anymore.
I'd just like also to mention that Russia released its science strategy, science collaboration strategy, where they state very clearly that they are ready to collaborate with friendly countries, and they don't mention any Western countries. So I think they will find new partners, and I think that also poses a threat to the science that we like to see, at least, because they might also impose other regimes, other ways of doing scientific research on new partners in other parts of the world.
Thank you.
Is that fabulous? Thank you. The one in the realms I work with in the Arctic, and I'd love to chat with you afterwards. The biggest advantage I have found in the 40 years I've worked out there is when you can identify where there is harm. Because when you can identify harm, it supersedes all political realms. When I started 40 years ago, I'm sitting there talking as like that age, and I'm talking to the head of ONR on a boat in the middle of the Arctic in 1984, and he wants me to work for them. And I'm going, but what do you got? I mean, this is like military stuff. He goes, no. There's the US, there is the Soviet Union, and then there is the Arctic. And in those days, the phrase was, the cold kills. But as of 2007, it's no longer the cold, it's the change. And it's the change that is going to kill. if we don't learn how to adapt. So I think a really huge part of any IPY initiative should be the real focus on scientific conduits to support the safety of all things polar. If you did that, you need a lot of science to do that correctly. And everybody agrees it's the harm it's the adaptation that needs to be focused on. When we went from 1957 to 2007, we are tipping this year. And so the harm can be projected, but the solutions to mitigate the harm, it's really, everybody agrees on that. You can tell very good stories on that. You can get a lot of alliances formed on that. There's lives. And once you start talking about, it's like COVID. A lot of people started cooperating who wouldn't have cooperated because lives were at stake, whole communities, whole systems of economies. So just as a comment.
Thank you. Go back to Barbara.
Thank you so much for your wonderful conversations. And I'm an indigenous scholar from Siberia, so I probably have more knowledge about what's going on in Russia, since I speak Russian and still have connections. And also my meta idea, which I think that after indigenizing Arctic research, I decided to indigenize Wall Street. So like a lot of things that you were discussing is very much related to me. So I have one comment and one question. I'll try to do one comment. As an indigenous person who have a history, very traumatic history of Soviet Union and our nation, almost like a whole nation, at least my family was sent to labor camps, and we often don't, as indigenous peoples, we often don't have choice, and things happen to us and we have to adapt. So that is my comment, because then they are talking about future of the Arctic or future of polar science. I think that we need to admit that it doesn't exist anymore. Like the things which were, or we wish, and actually that is also about business, we can wish things be different, but we are not. So Russia is not Russia 2021 before invasion. Russia is what it is, and they collaborate with China willingly. And yes, so it's happening, and we can pretend that we can change something, but I don't think that we can, because a lot of Russian scientists who are, which words to use, who are scientists, we left. And what is now in Russia, it's not science, it is propaganda. And that is a question for you. How, if we believe in data and good data and trust and good science, how can we try to collaborate with whatever friendly science of Russia and North Korea and China will be like in the future? Because that's how we alternate reality. Because, like, for example, we have people who still work in Russia and they know about, and I can give an example. For example, Business Index of the North, they released information, they released report based on Russian. We included Russia and we included official data. And this data does not represent military investments. It doesn't represent shadow fleet of Russian tankers in the Arctic carrying oil and gas. And I'm sorry, it's a huge investment. It's a huge thing happening in the Russian Arctic. And if we don't have this data officially. We cannot use it in our reports because it's not like non-official data. So how we can live in this reality when they kind of see it, but we kind of ignore it. They kind of trust it, but we. So that is the question. Because for me now, I don't know, but as an indigenous scholar, I know that we have to adapt and we have to live with it and we have to make a solution. We cannot just live in a pause. But yeah, so that's a question. Thank you.
Thank you. And what I will say is many of those comments, we are having these 3.5 days of conversations, and exactly what you're asking are some of these conversations that we're talking about, working through, talking with folks, and actually you and I talk about this quite a lot. So I think we couldn't put everything in this conversation here, but it's a very important point, and thank you. Does anyone else want to respond?
I would like to add a little bit of a personal note. I may not be an indigenous person, but I was born and I'm a refugee from a communist country. That is where I was born. And since my childhood, I have maintained that skepticism towards dictatorships when it comes to what they release in public. And basically, I've learned that they lie through their teeth whenever it is advantageous for them. And they do this with all means they have, including the sciences. And I have seen examples. I mean, you mentioned the Soviet Union, but we can even see this in other areas. And I've worked with Turkey, and similar things is actually happening even in those countries. So yes, we have to have that. That is the first observation. We have to be skeptical. Some of that is a mere lie for political advantage. Secondly, what I want to say is that who is to judge whether it's good data or not? Well, that is probably only a global scientific community, because we very often will be able to see what is based on propaganda and what is not. And the third thing is, yes, and a lot of things are lost already. We can't really, go back to history and say, oh yeah, restore it how it was. A lot of cultural achievements of indigenous cultures are lost, but not all of that. And in some places it's worse than others. And it is a matter of, you have to maintain a certain kind of optimism, at least certain parts of the day.
Yeah.
And if I'm confronted with a lot of these facts, I tend to be very pessimistic. But then, looking at future generations, I feel a need to be optimistic and say, hey, there are indications of where things do go better with industry or whatever, and even when it comes with collaborations with dictatorships sometimes. But yeah.
Thank you. Ola, last word, and then I'll let folks go. But.
Yeah, it's a very important and interesting comment you're making. I would just like to also to add that new paradoxes that are emerging in the situation, the global situation, geopolitical situation that we are in now. And one is that the number of democratic countries is decreasing. And I think that we need to be less naive collaborating with these countries also in the scientific sphere. And finally, this point that the investment in science from non-Arctic countries, primarily East Asian countries, has surpassed the investment from Arctic countries in Arctic science. So I think this poses challenges for the future that we need to find good solutions for.
So I'm going to, I'm a little past, one quick.
I can't leave this
One
on a
quick, then I'll
negative
let you go.
note. I'm sorry.
Go,
but
quick.
we're talking about data, right? And the lack of it. But Russia still contributes their data to the World Meteorological Organization, which helps to create all the climate models and all that. So we still have that. And the other thing, don't forget about the great progress we're making on space technologies. So we have a lot of wonderful data that we're collecting from space. So don't lose all hope.
Thank you. I will say, I was very bad pun that you've heard before is this, we've just touched the tip of the iceberg on all of the issues that our group is talking about with many folks around the Arctic. And there's so many different issues. We're all really focused though on how do people work together, work in parallel, find governance systems to tackle the global challenge, especially this challenge of climate, our climate future, climate action. What is a path forward that gives us optimism, isn't naive, is inclusive? And these are the conversations that are happening all over the world, but really with the change and the rapid change in the Arctic, they're a must, and we are moving towards some huge milestones. So we hope that this has been informative. Again, we haven't been able to solve anything, but we wanted to give a little bit of an understanding of all of the complexities and some hope and some challenges facing the Arctic and the polar regions. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks to my panelists. Thank you.